Welcome. This is F Rap Critic. It's your boy Malik 16 from Plates and Crates. And no, this is not the Prince symbol. We're not anti-Prince over here. We're not anti-anything. This is honestly the most Chicago t-shirt I had in my collection, and I figure it's only right to take it to Chicago. Shout out to all my Married with Children fans who know that this is the name of Al Bundy's secret basement gang of disgruntled husbands who are trying to get back at their wives and avoid, what we call it, Amazonian masterhood. The Manosphere section of YouTube would really appreciate that. So shout out to the Manosphere out there and those of y'all that follow it. But anyway, why is Chicago important? Well, Chicago is crucial because it's directly connected to the artist that we're talking about. And we brought this artist up episode 5 where we were going over the 1997 album No Way Out by Puff Daddy and the Family. And we were talking about none other than the Chicago ambassador, the Chicago God, as he used to call himself, Twista, and his 1997 album, Adrenaline Rush. Now, this is not his debut album, but it might as well be, because for a lot of us who are outside of Chicago, this was the birth of Twista as we've all come to grow and know him in the industry up to now. And so we're gonna get into a little bit of how that came to be. And of course, that makes this video number 1, which means we're going over category 1, which is the product, the album itself. Now, before we go any further, if you have not, please take this minute to like and subscribe to the channel so you can be a part of this global hip hop community that we are building. We are now 6 videos in, and if you've noticed, I have not put up any of the rankings, any of the scores yet. Why? Because we just don't have enough. So not even my scores have gone up, and the only way we can get that is if y'all start liking, subscribing, commenting, hitting me up, DMing me, emailing me with what you think each of these albums or whichever album you feel like chiming in on ranks to you. I would love to know, what did you feel about Salt and Pepper's album, E40's album, all the albums we've gone over so far. I'm just gonna continue making the videos in the meantime until we get these scores out there. And I'm itching, I wanna share my rankings too. And I promise I will have those rankings from Harlem Honey and from my nephew at some point soon, very soon. Okay. With no further ado, let's jump into it. The first dimension of category 1 is going to be the quality of the production. How dope were the beats on Adrenaline Rush? Well, really important point that we need to bring up is that this album carries the tradition which a lot of hip hop purists and fans in general feel should have never been abandoned, and that is the tradition of one rap act, one producer for the entire album. And this album is completely helmed and manned by the legendary Trackster. Legendary Trackster is so important to the Chicago sound of hip hop because legendary Trackster, for a good cluster of years, certainly brought it to the forefront where you had other rappers who existed. This is what kind of created a vibe of what Chicago music felt like in the 90s hip hop era, right? When it comes to 90s hip hop. And so, the other tidbit of that is understanding that legendary Trackster is responsible for the rebirth of Twista, for Twista even having this third album, because this was the label that legendary Trackster co-created and co-owned. So let's talk about this sound that was introduced. This sound is consisting of, you can say, 3 core elements, right? So there's 3 core elements you are going to get on a legendary Trackster beat in this era. In 1997, you were definitely going to get piano. And so what I like to describe it as is these lush, wet piano key sounds, especially on the slower songs, right? And then legendary Trackster also like to play with the often forgotten part of the piano scale, which is the lower end. So he's playing with those lower, deeper chords that a lot of rap producers weren't messing with until, you know, I think RZA came in and really made this a part that needs to be played with more. And then you'll hear how the Midwest really took advantage of that and really ran with it to get to these more cryptic and haunting kind of sounds. And then a lot of the echoey, the ripple effect keys is what I mean by wet keys. Like if a sound is not just gonna be a note, it's gonna go wom, 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 wom. It's gonna reverberate a little bit, right? So you're getting that kind of sound, which started to define a lot of Southern and Midwest hip hop in the mid-90s, to the point where I think, it was very easy if you lived outside of those areas to confuse the two. Suave House records were using that sound a lot. Rap A Lot was using that sound a lot. And tracks had a lot to do with some of those songs. So it only makes sense. That's coupled with a lot of bass, a lot of trembling, rumbling kind of bass. But the other part of this triangle here of ingredients, the modulated sounds, not unlike what was going on in the West Coast. So again, that modulated funky worm, but Traxta is playing with modulated whistles, and it's almost like a laser kind of sound. And I think the Midwest also ran with that too. Whether it's a softer song, it's a modulated whistle, and if it's a harder song, it's like this modulated funky worm, to the point where it sounds like a laser piercing through and riding on top of that bass line and the key melody. This was laying the foundation for the Chicago sound with those wet, rippling key effects, those laser-like modulated sounds, lots of rumbling bass, and hi-hats. Hi-hats everywhere to kind of match up with how fast who was rapping on it. And it just happens to be the fastest rapper ever at the time rapping on it. So it only made sense. But you're gonna get that, in the background. You're getting that, because the drums weren't the emphasis here. What was the emphasis were the keys, the bass, and that modulation, man. That modulation, you will hear it on every song. As the Midwest started taking things in this darker territory, it was always balanced by the bluesy funk. This was just always in the background, giving it a grounded kind of feel. Like, okay, we're gonna get dark, but we're not gonna get like we're in the basement playing the Ouija board dark. That's something that I think, groups like 3 6 Mafia experimented more with. And even Bone Thugs, but even Bone Thugs kept that Midwest sensibility of here's some bluesy, tones in the background to keep it down to earth. We're not shooting off into space or going down to hell, even though we're talking about it, we're just trying to scare you with that. So you get these menacing sounds, adrenaline rush. Overdose has these hollow instruments in it that really drive the point home. It leaves the beat open enough for Twista to like rap in every part of it, but it has like almost a scary movie effect because of those hollow sounds. Adrenaline Rush is just made for the cars, made for a system where that bass could be heard. It's meant to sound antagonistic and menacing, and it does. And a lot of the songs on this album sound like that. Really something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes it to dimension 2. So you're talking about one producer single-handedly creating a sound for everyone to hear outside of a city that before wasn't really known for having a sound. And what are the pitfalls with that? You could easily run the risk of everything sounding too similar. And this is a 13-track album. We always talk about 13 being that safe number for a classic. 13, 14, 12. That's where you kind of want to roll the dice and have them land. Now, this album does play with everything in Traxta's arsenal. They even remake Nothing But a G Thing, but in their own style. Replayed elements, reinterpolated sounds, still keeping the vein of it, the spirit of it, but it's being played with different modulations, different instruments, but that same melody, just to show that he could, lighten it up and get playful. But then you go right back into it with the hard tracks like No Remorse, and then I think the darkest track is Unsolved Mystery. It's also the simplest track, right? And so you get these, those deep keys again. We on the lower scale of the piano. and it's just a simple beat that just knocks. It's about, 4 main notes, and it just goes back and forth, but it builds up, and Twista is the final instrument on it. So you get this nice mix of the lighter songs. And now the lighter songs are all very deliberate. Like I said, when we talk about Mobster's anthem with the Nothing But a G thing, then that's being played with because of the familiarity. We get It Wet, we get Feel So Good, we get Emotions. They're all cut in the same vein of being, okay, these are the girl songs, these are the sexy songs, we're using these wet piano keys. All of those songs kind of sound like they come from the, dare I say it, the R. Kelly school of this is what Chicago sounds like. This is what we sound like when we trying to rap to a girl. This is what we sound like when we thinking of, lighter fare. And so you get about 3 of those, you add, the anthem song, which was the Nothing But a G thing, that's 4, and then the rest of the production kind of battles between being medium dark and then dark, right? So I would say Unsolved Mystery, Overdose, Adrenaline Rush, those are the darker ones. Death Before Dishonor and Corrupt World and No Remorse, those are kind of, medium dark. So there's a mix here. There's a mix. It's almost like you go to a place that only gives you 3 selections. Like if Harold's only had light meat, medium dark meat, or dark meat. Like that's all you're getting. There's no medium. It's medium dark. So that's the best way I could put it in Chicago terms. And I do think they do a good job in the sequencing of putting the light songs right after there's been a fair amount of dark, and medium dark, right? So, they're spaced very well. You don't have 2 of the girl songs right next to each other, and you don't have the darkest songs right next to each other. They do mix it up as best as they could on an album with this kind of content and at this length. All right, so something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5. Heartbeats, that takes us to dimension 3. Is there an intentional mood or tone on this album? At the very least, I'd say what seemed the most intentional here was to give you a glimpse of street Chicago. I think Twista was very aware that there were no street Chicago artists who had broken into the mainstream at that point in hip hop. This is 1997. You had Common, you had some other names, but I think Twista was very definitive about wanting to fill a gap and create a niche and cement his space and reclaim something. Remember, this is someone who had been out before, but he's like, you know what? Nobody's really repped Chicago the way I'm about to rep it. I'm gonna use Chicago slang all throughout this, and it's evident in the skits from the intro to the outro. They made sure they got the most Chicago people at the time, from his crew or the extras, whoever was in there, on every skit, there's a heavy use of Chicago accent and Chicago slang and Chicago references to streets, local places, and names for these areas, K-Town, the hundreds, you're getting a lot of that. And that's something, you really, it's evident. There's no way to avoid that. Other than that, I don't know if there's any other intentional mood or tone because of the content. And we'll talk about that in a few. But yeah, it was a glimpse into Chicago from the street side, but also very deliberate in knowing I want to take this mainstream. I'm not trying to be an underground rapper. I'm coming for my proper. Something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5. Heartbeats, that takes us to dimension 4, which is song distinction versus the repetition of words and sounds on this album. Man, for somebody who is using about who knows how many words per minute, per verse, as Twista, you would think there'd be some redundancy. There's none. You want to talk about someone that does not waste a word. There's no time to waste words when you're coming and you're trying to prove a point, where you're back for the first time, when your third album feels like your first album. That is how the words were approached on here. We already talked about Legendary Tracks' production, and there being this idea of, how often are you hearing redundancy or the same sounds? You're hearing the same sounds, but you're hearing the same sounds played with in different ways on every track. The keys on Unsolved Mystery do not sound like the keys on Death Before Dishonor. You're getting taken into different pockets of what both the rapper and the producer does. This was very much a showcase for both of them. Traxter was bringing his A game, it seems, or at least his versatility game, because as much as modulation is repeated throughout this album, it's just not the same way. You're getting different each song. And again, Twista's not wasting words, so something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. How important is that to you that the songs sound different from each other? And that takes us to dimension 5, which is the question of the content versus the amount of songs. 13 songs, really 12, if you're not counting the remix to Emotions. If you think about it, it really is only 10 songs, because one is an intro, one is a skit, and again, you got that Emotions remix. So that leaves it in a really safe number count for not too much flack for there not being a lot to talk about. But if we already pointed out that there's not a lot of repetition of words, there's a good amount of unique word usage here. The redundancy and repetition comes in what's being talked about. When it comes to content, yeah, there's not a lot of content on this album. If we're talking about anything with real depth, what you are getting is a lyrical display of how nice Twista is. There's 2 modalities on this album. There is attention to getting to women, usually in a sexual context, and the other part is lots and lots of murder. It might sound senseless or reckless, but then you listen to the intricacies of what Twista's saying on some songs, and there's even a line where he's like, I thought we got into this to get out of pistol handling, but that's one line in a sea of many lines describing what he and his crew will do to you with guns on every song where it's not about women. So again, Emotions, Feel So Good, Get It Wet is where we're taking a break. We're putting the gun on the dresser to go get laid. That's where you get the most. The closest we get to content is on the song like Corrupt World, where there's a modest effort to try to speak on some stuff. But 12 songs, 13 if you count the Emotions remix, 2 modalities, murder and missionary. I mean, it's what can you say? Sticks to the program that works. Okay, so something for y'all to rate on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, which takes us to dimension 6, features. Okay. Most of the features here are from local rap acts that are affiliated with the label. A nice little cameo from Johnny P, who sings on Emotions in a very similar way that he did on the Do or Die song that features Twista. And you get Miss Kane, sometimes called Erica Kane, who makes an appearance on Get It Wet. You got the Speeding Out Mobsters on the Mobsters Anthem. They make another appearance later on No Remorse. And you also get Young Buck of Psychodrama on Adrenaline Rush, who sets the album off, with a really memorable verse, because, at this point, everyone was kind of even tier for the rest of the world, at least. People knew Twista as much as they knew Psychodrama, as much as they knew Crucial Conflict, as much as they knew any other Chicago rapper, because nobody had burst all the way through yet. in Chicago, Twista probably had more of a name because he had been established prior, but this was such an iconic feature just because the matching of Young Buck's approach and his voice and his tone juxtaposed with Twista's approach, it was a dynamic pairing. You know, you're talking about somebody rapping deep and slow, enunciating every word and kind of weaving through, and then Twista comes with the acceleration, and and they're both aggressive in their own right without being like rah-rah voiced. It's like, oh, you believe this because our tones balance each other and they match perfect with this really, really, rattling beat, right? And then the other guest appearances, for the most part, they complement Twista too, because no one tries to do what Twista does on this album. There's rappers that they do a give and go, or might have a more pickup flow and pacing, but no one ever tries to go tit for tat. I'm a speed rap with Twista, so it makes Twista's verses the kind of icing on the cake, the verse you've been waiting for. Like when you know, hey, I'm gonna come in last because I'm gonna kill it. I'm gonna let all my other people go, and it becomes a nice compliment to Twista doing what he does on the songs when the guest, is the one who evens it out with digestible and easy to follow rhyme patterns. So really would love to know, especially if you're from Chicago, how you felt about the features on this album. And if you're not from Chicago, not knowing these rappers who are on there, did it take away, did it add? Were the features nice because they balanced Twista, or would you have liked to hear other people try to rap and keep up with Twista? A real challenge for the kid. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 7. Speaking of takeaways, do the weakest songs on this album take away? That is completely up to you, what you consider to be the weakest songs on this. It's a short album. It's pretty straight to the point. Maybe you do not like songs with singing on the hook. If you do not, then you will not like the girl songs, quote unquote, on this album, because each and every one of them have singing. Maybe you don't like that, that kind of sound. Maybe the dark beats turn you off. It's hard to say. Only thing I can say maybe a little weak is Johnny P singing a hook on Emotions that sounded very similar to the hook he sang on Po Pimp by Do or Die. It was almost too easy. It was almost too much of the same. But I don't know if that's a super weak point. Something for y'all to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. How weak was the weakest song on this album, and did it take away? All right, Dimension 8, Mass Appeal. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, this was the album that took Twista out of Chicago, just being known in the city of Chicago and being known elsewhere. Twista became a go-to guy when you needed somebody to speed rap or pick up the pace on your song and elevate it. Unfortunately, they have their own effect of pigeonholing, right? But it was great for recognition and being widely known. There was no longer any debate on who's the fastest rapper, who do I get when I want someone to rap fast, what does Chicago sound like. We now had a vehicle through this album. We had an introduction to a Chicago sound and a go-to Chicago rapper who could make radio hits. There was an intention on this album to not only get played in the streets, but also to win the radio and the women over. And you can tell from singles like Emotions and Get It Wet, which have lived on to this day. They are still, Chicago classics, and they're still put on people's playlists when they're making, sex playlists and sexy song playlists and stuff like that. Same way, Adrenaline Rush and Overdose have become gangster classics. So really interesting stuff, and it did what it set out to do. It established the Chicago sound. It reestablished Twista as a force and a go-to person and a face and a name that you can easily put together, and it created sales. This is a gold album. Big success For 1997, the year that where we stated that nobody was really eating that didn't affiliate themselves with Puffy or that wave of jigginess and mafioso and you know, Versace, like Twista aired more on that side while still staying in the middle. So something for y'all to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 9, the 3 I's: impact, innovation, and influence. And so we talk about impact. We just talked about how this album went gold, how this album established not only Twista, but established Traxtor and the Chicago sound. Now people were seeking this out. Now people were seeking Twista out. Now people had an idea of what was going on in Chicago and what was relevant there. And now we talk about innovation. You got to understand where Twista's career come from. Twista came from being more along the lines of the Afrocentric rappers, and back in that era where you had to have a definitive sound to stand out from everyone else. So even though fast rap was a thing, you had your Chip Fu from Fu-Schnickens, and Twista came out slightly, maybe 1 year before, but you had rappers who were rapping fast. Twista's whole niche was, I'm gonna rap the fastest. He broke the World Guinness Book record of being the fastest rapper at that time. And back then, the Chicago part was pretty important, but not as important as proving that you are better than your competition. So most of his first album had to do with showcasing how special his sound was and how much better he is than other rappers. He had, you know, songs like No Peace Sign, where he was speaking more in Afrocentricity and being authentic. There are a lot of 5% stylings splashed in between his rap. I think by the time you get to this album, he leans more towards Christianity than anything else. But in the middle, you got this album called Resurrection. It wound up getting shelved, and this is supposed to be like an urban legend type album, a classic to those who are in the know in Chicago. And there he had totally abandoned the fast rap style because he wanted to be heard. He still did a super packed multi-syllabalistic style of rapping, but he did more of a style that was much more prominent in that 1994, 95 era. And the beats almost sounded like the production that you would have heard on Big L's first album, you know. And so his point was really just to prove his lyrical prowess and his sharpness. That was an all don't take me as a joke, I'm not a gimmick album. He only speeds up one time on the final verse of one song, which is Suicide, which was his diss song to Naughty by Nature and the Peanuts for, you know, calling his style a gimmick or insinuating that Chicago wasn't serious and it was a gimmick and his style was a gimmick. So this album was all about repping Chicago like never before. But the accent wasn't as heavy on either of these albums. So what happens now is that Twista found his groove. What he did, he married those two styles and created his niche. By then, Bone Thugs had been out. They emerged as the quintessential fast rappers. Anyone who was gonna come after was destined to be compared. Twista had the edge of being able to say I was first, but he didn't quite sound the way he sounded on this album on either of his two albums. So what he did is he found a happy medium between the two, and also a way not to sound directly like Bone, because he wasn't doing the type of flowing that they were doing. He was rhyming in different spaces, which became kind of the go-to Chicago rap style. But yeah, he somewhere between that super duper fast flow he was doing on his first album and the multi-syllabalistic, more aggressive, cursing everywhere, rapping Chicago style, he found his accent and he found his speed. The influence is a whole generation of rappers afterwards, you know, started identifying Chicago as more of the gangster city that Twista introduced us to than the windy city that rappers like Common introduced us to. And so I think he had a lot to do with the, you know, continuing keeping the spirit of the deep, dark, haunting beats, him and Traxter Alive, to where the next generation just took it a step further and created drill music. Also, here's how to rap fast and still be a spitter. I think you started hearing this was a requisite for Midwest rappers now. They had to prove not only could they rap slow and, you know, in a groove and keep it funky and gangster, but they had to speed it up at some point. And you'll still hear that to this day. Every Midwest rapper from Freddie Gibbs to, you know, even a Lupe or Royce, they have to turn it up 1 second and let you know they fast rap. It's kind of in their DNA. They have to. Even Machine Gun Kelly, you know, it's just like, that's a rites of passage for Midwest rappers. So I think that influence definitely. How could you not associate it with Twista, even if it's not from this album? The legacy of the build-up from Tung Twista to Resurrection, you know, Running Off at the Mouth to Resurrection to Adrenaline Rush, it's a part of the culture now. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to the final dimension, dimension 10, the timelessness and uniqueness of this album. Like I said, Twista had created a style that the mainstream had not heard. The casual listener would quickly compare Twista to Bone Thugs, but anybody who really listened to rap would be like, nah, they rap 2 different ways, you know, and he created a lane. Now that style is forever in hip hop commercial releases. People know that there's a way to rap like this. It's unique because it didn't sound like anything from Twista before. It also just didn't sound like anything that was going on. Yeah, you might have heard some of those beats. Like I said, it was a very suave house sound, a very South and Midwest sound on some of the dark and light tracks, but you didn't hear anybody approaching it the way that Twista did. And there's a reason why those songs like, you know, Get It Wet and Adrenaline Rush are still referred to, still bump in people's playlists to this day. I think there's a timelessness quality. Most of these songs stand the test of time, so much so that Adrenaline Rush was remade by Cameron on his 2004 album, Purple Haze. That's 7 years later, you know, and it's still not. For a lot of people, that was their introduction to this song. It was new, and the rappers on it rapped in the same cadences that they rapped on the original, and it still sounded crispy. So those songs have not yet died. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That has been all 10 dimensions in this category 1, the product, the album itself. And, you know, I hope you enjoyed that breakdown. You already know what to do. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Until then, F for Rap Critic. Word to mouth.